This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 956 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. Before answering some mailbag questions this week, I want to remind you to check out Underdog. There are tons of snake drafts that you can join right now over there. For not just this week's slate of games either, but for the playoffs as well. That's right, playoff best ball is here. And there's one contest, the Gauntlet, that's a $25 entry. There's $2 million in prizes. Now, if that's too high of an entry point for you, you can also join the $3 per entry Little Mitten, where there's $50,000 in prizes. There's always something at Underdog that will fit what you're looking for. If you've never played over there, make sure you sign up right now with promo code LATEROUND. You get a nice deposit offer and my rest of season rankings with that promo code. That's UnderdogFantasy.com, promo code LATEROUND. The first question this week is from Zach on Blue Sky. It says, do you think that you should approach week 14 or whatever your last non-playoff week is in a given league differently when you're already locked into a specific playoff seed? Yes, most definitely. As long as you're following the rules of your league. And that's key. If your league says you have to fill your entire starting roster, then you've got to fill your entire starting roster. But if nothing's going to change for you, then you need to plan ahead. You, of course, want integrity. You want to field a solid lineup so that the rest of your league isn't getting screwed over by you and how you're managing your Week 14 team. But for example, you're going to worry a whole lot less about Week 14 players, specifically defenses. That's the easiest example. Like, waivers are over right now, but if I knew that my seed was locked up, I would never use free agent budget or waiver wire priority on a defense for Week 14. There's no reason to. Just wait until waivers run. Or maybe you've just been streaming quarterbacks. Focus only on Week 15 if that's the case. Or Week 16 if you have a bye. Don't worry about fielding the best quarterback in Week 14 because Week 14 doesn't matter for you. You can use a quarterback, but use that Week 15 or Week 16 quarterback in your spot in Week 14. So yeah, your management can definitely change. But make sure you're not being annoying and ignoring your league's rules. And if you do something like lose a game on purpose so that a certain team doesn't make the playoffs in your league that you don't want to face in the playoffs, just know that karma's going to get you. In all seriousness though, just know that we often overrate our ability to predict who's going to be good and who's not going to be good in a given week. That's all. But yes, overall, you should change your approach if you're locked into a specific seed. This next question is also from Blue Sky. It's from Tony Lung. It says, who to trust from the Browns' 3 wide receivers? Will Cedric Tillman retake the top spot, or has Jerry Jeudy taken over? If Tillman is cleared to play, can we trust Elijah Moore? I think Winston can support 2 of them, plus David Njoku. Love the show. Thanks. Thanks, Tony. So I don't want to take anything away from Cedric Tillman when I say this, because he was playing really well when Amari Cooper was first traded. But his numbers, his usage, didn't necessarily tell us that he was the number 1 wide receiver in Cleveland, like the clear-cut number 1 guy. From week 7 through week 11, so that's 4 games before he had his concussion against Pittsburgh, Tillman was averaging a target share per game rate of 22%. He had 40 targets. Jerry Jeudy during that same time frame had a 20% target share and 35 targets. Elijah Moore was at 36 targets. In other words, targets were being spread around that offense. Not just to one guy, not just to Cedric Tillman. Now, Tillman was seeing slightly more valuable targets during this time frame. According to PFF's expected fantasy points formula, Tillman had a fantasy points per game expectation of 18.4 during that time. Jerry Jeudy was at 16.3, Elijah Moore, 15.2. But this wasn't some scenario where like Tillman was light years ahead of the other wide receivers in Cleveland. And things were cooling off for him a bit after some really good games without Amari Cooper. Like if we were to throw in that Pittsburgh game as well, because he was concussed late in that game, then we wouldn't really see that much of a difference between a guy like Tillman and Jerry Jeudy at all. I think this is a scenario where the Browns are going to deploy their 3 wide receivers the same way they've been deploying them with a healthy Tillman. And matchups are going to dictate where some of those looks are going to go. To me, though, it's tough to not be impressed with what Jerry Jeudy's doing right now. His first game without Amari Cooper was kind of rough, but since week 8, he's seen yardage totals of 79, 73, 142, 85, and 235. We've always just needed consistency with Jerry Jeudy. And I think having a quarterback who's not afraid to take some chances down the field is really helping him out. So to answer your question, I think all of them are in play in their own ways. I'd rank them Jeudy, then Tillman, then Elijah Moore rest of season. And I put Moore last because the other 2 wide receivers are probably going to see down the field targets a little bit more. They'll probably be used a little bit more in the red zone too. But there are going to probably be weeks where Tillman outscores Jeudy and vice versa. The important thing is that there can still be a decent floor for the guy who gets outscored because there's enough passing volume in this Browns offense. So if Jerry Jeudy outscores Cedric Tillman, Tillman's not automatically a 0 and vice versa. And look, if you look at their schedule, it's not great on paper. They get Pittsburgh, Kansas City, Cincinnati, and Miami to close out the fantasy season. Typically, I'd be really afraid about using these wide receivers. But what all those teams have in common is that they could force Cleveland into a negative game script. And that's not necessarily a terrible thing for this Browns offense because they'll push the ball down the field and they'll throw it a lot in that environment. Now, I'd rather the schedule be a cakewalk, of course. But at least they have a quarterback and an offensive environment now where things aren't total dust when they're facing a tough matchup. So I think Winston can support all of them in their own different way. It's just that they're not going to all go off each week. And I don't think there's going to be the same odd man out week in and week out. It's not going to be that clean. This next question is from Twitter. It's from @FantasyTrolls. It says, better deep stash, Patrick Taylor or Sean Tucker? So to me, this is Sean Tucker. Patrick Taylor has actually been around the league since 2021. He's on his second team. And he hasn't gotten a ton of run for that team because he hasn't dressed for them week in and week out. Now, of course, there are some good backs ahead of him on the depth chart, but it does signal a talent problem to some degree. And you could argue that he has more of an opening right now than Sean Tucker does, yes. But do we think there's a tremendous amount of upside with Patrick Taylor? I'm not so sure. With Tucker, we've seen the upside. The Buccaneers also have a better schedule than the 49ers rest of season. And there are multiple injury outs with Sean Tucker right now, like I said on the 15 Transactions episode. So Taylor may project better because he has more of a role right now than Sean Tucker. But what is that projection actually getting you? And that role isn't even set in stone right now. But Tucker's the upside play, and we're stashing players here, and we're looking for upside. Also, I wasn't able to talk about it in the 15 Transactions episode because it happened after everything was published, but Patrick Taylor now has a chance to not even be the clear-cut RB2 in that offense. The 49ers signed Izzy Abanikanda, and I actually think that Izzy could fit really well in this offense. He's a bigger-bodied guy who has a lot of speed for his size, and that speed is an element that Kyle Shanahan knows how to take advantage of. He loves that in his running backs. So keep Izzy in mind here too. And also, hail to Pitt. This next question is from Twitter. It says, can we talk JSN going forward and beyond? He seems to be emerging, but there isn't a lot of chatter. Yeah, look, JSN's doing his thing, and it's great to see because my prospect model really loved him. Now, there are a couple of things happening. First, he's just seeing more work. Last week was a lower point for him, which is a 14% target share, but since week 8, he's averaged a 28% target share per game rate. Now, DK Metcalf missed a couple of games in there, and he may not even be 100% right now. But JSN is still at a 25% target share per game rate over his last 3. The big question we should be asking, though, is what really changed? Why was he kind of disappointing and more of a floor play to start the year, but it all switched during the second half? Well, that target share changed. Sometimes there's a little bit of variance with how teams are targeting their wide receivers. And the Seahawks have definitely targeted JSN more. To start the season, his target share per game rate was just 19%. So it's been like 6 to 9 percentage points higher over his last 5 games, depending on if DK Metcalf is in or out of the lineup. So he's just being targeted at a higher rate. That's a signal for talent. Now, from a deployment perspective, he's still running the slot. 83% of his routes have come from that area of the field over his last 3 games. That number is actually 85% since week 8. So this isn't like a DK Metcalf is in or out kind of thing. To start the year from week 1 to 7, he was at 86%. So he's playing the slot pretty similarly. But one big difference is his average depth of target. It's risen by almost 2 yards from the first 7 games to his last 5. And then all the while, his catchable target rate is 85% during that time, according to PFF data. That was 76% to start the year. So let's just paint this picture. I know I threw a lot at you just now. To start the season, before he started running hot, JSN had a 19% target share. His average depth of target was lower than what he's seen recently, and his catchable target rate was also lower. All of those things have risen, some of them pretty dramatically. That's why we're seeing more production from JSN. Now, to be clear, JSN has still played over expectation over this 5-game stretch that I keep referencing. According to PFF's expected fantasy points formula, JSN is 13th in expected fantasy points per game during this time, but he's been 4th in actual points per game. He's outperforming expectation. And you have to wonder if DK Metcalf will eventually turn things around a little bit. But at the very least, I don't think we're bound to go back to early 2024 Jaxon Smith-Njigba. He's looking like a very, very legit slot player. And we know based on his pedigree that he can do more than that. So we should be optimistic. Just don't expect 20 points per game from here on out. The last question this week is from @btort20 on Twitter. It says, who are a couple of players you think will either be championship drivers or killers? So I'm taking this question to basically mean which players are going to help you win a championship and which players who might seem reliable could hurt your chances of winning a championship. So let's have some fun here. I've got 2 underperformers and then 1 overperformer. I feel like we can go on and on with a list like this, but I'd rather keep things more succinct. Now, I've talked about it before, but 2 running backs have some tough matchups in the fantasy playoffs. DeAndre Swift is one. The Bears get the Vikings and the Lions in weeks 15 and 16. And Swift has had moments over the last few weeks where his snap share has fallen to below 55%. He also hasn't had a target share at or above 10% since week 9. And he's played Minnesota and Detroit over his last 2 games. He's failed to score 10 PPR points in both of those games. So he's a little bit scary. Najee Harris is the other one. Now, I had Najee as a target in my draft guide this year, but I called him out as a sell a handful of weeks ago because of 2 things. Number 1, Jaylen Warren was getting healthier. Number 2, he had tough playoff matchups. Now, over his last 4 games, Harris has been pretty mediocre in 3 of them. Even with a touchdown against the Commanders, he scored just 11.3 PPR points. But he dominated the Bengals, so that may be changing people's perceptions a little bit. But he gets Philly, Baltimore, and Kansas City in the fantasy playoffs. The Eagles are a bottom 5 matchup for running backs by adjusted points allowed. The Ravens are a bottom 10 matchup. The Chiefs are the absolute toughest matchup. Now, I think that he can still see volume and be like fine, but I'm worried about the ceiling outcomes here. That's what the discussion with him was all about in the first place. Now, on the flip side, I'm not going to say someone like Bucky Irving, who's pretty obvious at this point and who I already talked about a couple of weeks ago. Because you have to remember, a lot of these guys I've talked about on the 15 Transactions episode. That's what that episode is about every single week. Like Tony Pollard this past week. Already shouted him out. But there's one player that I want to bring up again, who I've talked about plenty, but who still is not getting the love that he deserves, and who I think could be really, really productive down the stretch. It's Jakobi Meyers. Myers continues to be someone that I'm much, much higher on versus consensus. Like I'm talking 10 wide receiver spots higher in my rest of season rankings. Because I think he might crush the month of December. And the reason for that is simple. He's seeing a lot of volume, he's a good wide receiver, and the Raiders have a cakewalk schedule from here on out. Myers ranks 15th in the NFL in expected fantasy points per game since Davante Adams left Vegas. His target share per game rate is almost 30% during that time frame. In the fantasy playoffs, he gets the Falcons, the Jags, and the Saints. Those are 2 top 5 opponents for wide receivers by adjusted points allowed, and then the Saints, they rank as the 11th best opponent. Things are set up very, very well for Jakobi Meyers. And honestly, it starts this week because they get the Buccaneers. I just don't think that people realize how strong he can be in fantasy football. So Swift and Najee for the guys who may not have high enough of a ceiling, and then Myers as my lower key league winner this year. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you had subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. You can find me on Blue Sky as well, same exact handle. Thanks for listening, everyone. There's a Late Round Perspectives episode that drops in just a couple of hours. Hope you give that a listen. Otherwise, best of luck in Week 14. I'll talk to you next week.